Welcome, folks. Thank you for joining us today for From Paradox to Coherence, Aligning Investment and Philanthropy Towards Systemic Change. So today we have a pretty packed agenda. We are going to be hearing from some amazing guest speakers today. I am one of your hosts, Faith Flanagan, co-founder of Regenerosity, as well as the 360 lead. Jackie, can you pull the screen? Thank you. We'd love to see the guests here today. Thank you all for joining us. This webinar is hosted by Regenerosity and Be the Earth as part of a joint inquiry and practice into more equitable and regenerative forms of philanthropy. Today, we have one of our largest webinars. We have over 550 people RSVP to this webinar. So that tells us that's a very important topic to be speaking to today. We're really, really lucky to have Lynn Murphy facilitating and leading the webinar. Lynn is the founder of Transition Resource Circle, and we're partnering with Transition Resource Circle on this webinar series, and we'll be getting into a panel discussion with our speakers, Jennifer Astone, Matthew Monahan, Tim Frolink, and Renata Streganowski, and we'll end with questions from the audience. We ask that folks stay on mute for the entire webinar. If you have questions, please put them in the chat. We'll actually go through the panel discussion and we'll capture questions in the chat, and then we'll share those questions back with Lynn and go through any of the questions that you might have. But I'm going to pass it over to my co-founder, Ruth Andrade, and we can get started. Again, thank you guys for joining.
Hello, everyone. Welcome. So nice to see so many familiar faces and names of folks joining the call. I'm Ruth Andrade, and one of many of my roles in supporting regenerative cultures is as board chair of Regenerosity. Regenerosity is a nonprofit that resources and strengthens grassroots leaders and organizations regenerating our planet. And at the moment, we have programs in both Brazil and East Africa. And part of our work is mobilizing resources, helping organizations grow their programs. We also build peer-to-peer learning networks, support connections to the wider ecosystem and other funding, and help amplify those stories. For example, now in Brazil, we're funding 4 organizations, part of our Blossom program, like a regenerative cultivator program, that are working on indigenous biocentric restoration in the drylands of Brazil, working with water, with food forest, in stewarding and saving their sacred lands. And as those organizations grow their impact, then we also know that communities can become more resilient. We are revitalizing ancestral wisdom and regenerating ecosystem. And it's on the basis of their shared story that we're here today. And as we know, with everything happening in the world, there's never been a better time for doing this work. There's never been a better time for protecting and regenerating our planet. It's an extraordinary moment, as you all know. I'm sure we were just discussing before this webinar how sometimes we need to take a break in reading the news because it's so overwhelming. But if you're in the thick of it, you cannot turn off the news. If you are in the frontline communities that are already being displaced by war and climate change, there is nowhere to look away. There is nowhere to feel safe or comfortable. And we're also seeing the political will for all the commitments that we thought we had secured. They're all retreating fast. You know, even the UK government massively reduced its development budget. So what do? You know, we can see this reality. We're working with folks where that is their day-to-day reality. And at the same time, we're seeing philanthropy sitting on trillions. And I actually checked the number. It's 1.8 trillion US dollars that foundations hold in assets and donor advised funds. 1.8 trillion dollars that could be used, you know, for supporting life at this point, but is sitting in investments. And those investments are often funding the very systems that are causing the harm that the philanthropy is trying to support. So they're released slowly, conditionally, and not at the scale that the moment demands. So that gap between what's needed and how money is actually flowing has never felt more urgent to close. So aligning and cohering how capital flows with what we say we believe in is no longer a nice idea. It's now become existential. And I think that's the same, like aligning where our money is and where our values are. It doesn't matter if you donate from your paycheck or if you're a billionaire with big philanthropic dreams. It doesn't matter. We all need to align how capital flows to our values. So this year, as part of the webinars that we do with Be the Earth Foundation and Regenerosity, we really want to focus on moving money in service of life, especially for capital stewarded by foundations, family offices, philanthropic individuals. We want to talk about investing endowments meaningfully, catalytic blended finance, spending down, and even more radically, how do we create a just economic system that doesn't need philanthropy anymore? So today, in our first session of this four-part series, we're going to start with coherence. How do we align our investments to our philanthropy? And again, it doesn't matter how big or small your gift is and your investments, it's important that we seek coherence. And to join us along all these webinars and to join us on this journey, I have the pleasure of working with Lynn Murphy from the Transition Resource Circle. She's going to be our host and facilitator throughout these webinars. And I met Lynn and Honor in about 10 years ago, actually. I was reflecting on this today, 10 years ago, and been following that work as true activists. This idea of getting philanthropy to play a more critical role to rebalance wealth, power, and historical injustices. So over to you, Lynn, and our amazing panel. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ruth. Thank you, Faith. Greetings to all of you who are here, to the other panels. Greeting to all the lands where you sit, to all the ancestors that flow through you, to all the beings that you can see or not see that are around you, to greetings to the monies that you steward personally and professionally. Yeah. Thank you again to Regenerosity for this wonderful collaboration. And perhaps just a word on Transition Resource Circle to help kind of offer a way into this inquiry today. Along with Alnor Lada, we met each other some years ago after I had left Philanthropy, partly because of this large contradiction or paradox that we're speaking of, watching endowments invested on the one side and then the grant makings trying to kind of undo a lot of what we saw happening within extractive capital of the endowments, with sitting in the global north being able to have undue power and influence over decisions that were happening in the global majority, and a whole set of other things that felt stuck in the what Vanessa Andreotti would call the house of modernity, but just not actually having space to respond to what some would call the polycrisis, or what we often will call the meta crisis. So Transition Resource Circle began as an offering to look at how we're caught in systems and logics of extraction and domination, and find ways of moving ones that are in coherence with life, moving towards life-affirming systems, to focusing on resources. How do we use capital to liberate capital? How do we move money in service of life? How do we move from the paradox to the coherence, and perhaps someday from the contradictions even into compost with the existing structures and logics that we have? And circle ways. How do we have many, many ways of seeing, many ways of knowing, a circle, a broad group of people beyond just funders and wealth holders and activists, but to cosmologists and indigenous leaders and others to guide us? So in that inquiry, we were looking at some offerings that monies are actually the world's collective endowments, often made through unjust means. So what does that mean to actually work with that contradiction and paradox? And we were looking specifically at philanthropy, not just, well, trying to do some honest reckoning with philanthropy as an extension of capitalism, as an externality of capitalism, a side effect to what I hope we can explore in this webinar, to philanthropy and other stewards of wealth actually moving into being the vanguards of moving in service of life, and perhaps even alchemists. So the book Post-Capitalist Philanthropy came out of that inquiry, and we continue to walk with that inquiry and walk with many people's many ways of knowing to find how we really can respond to this moment. Perhaps the last thing to say, because this will come up in some of the questions, is that we often refer to the meta crisis, to acknowledge that this is not just something outside of us that lives in systems, but it lives within us, and it lives within our relational ways. It lives within the logics that we see and that we run our institutions through and by. And so we're really trying to look at the connections between the inner and the outer to find how we really move money in service of life. So really delighted for this first offering today. As we go along this webinar series, we'll go deeper and deeper into what really is it to build coherence from the money, from the institutions, from the instruments, into our ethical relationships, into the way that even perhaps into some of the different ontologies that we approach these questions with. So that's for down the road. But today we want to just offer, first and foremost, our four very esteemed panelists the space to introduce themselves and introduce their work in relationship to this topic of how is it that we're moving from this giant paradox of that 1.8 trillion, at least of what is purported, and the logics that a lot of those monies are invested in and continuing to get return on investments, towards walking more and more into coherence. So with that, perhaps we'll start with Tim and ask Tim to introduce himself, and then Matthew, and then Jennifer, and then Renata.
Hi, everybody. Tim Freundlich, primarily with Impact Assets that I founded and was the CEO for the first decade. But I've been working in the impact investing space for about 28 and a half years at this point, all the way back to early Calvert days. And Impact Assets is sort of a full spectrum capital endowment for about 2,000 families and individuals and groups of individuals, actually, all on a common architecture to do pretty much any kind of deep impact investing that you could imagine, from microfinance to housing to clean technologies, shared ownership, sustainable ocean, on and on and on. There's about 5.2 billion US in that asset base at this point, and 1,500 investments all over the world, adding probably one a business day at this point, which is pretty amazing to me, and a little crazy if you think about the cadence of that. And I'd say, what I would bring just to start or finish my introduction is, there's this quote from Ilya Prigozhin, which is attributed to this chemist physicist who won the Nobel in 1977. It goes something like, when a system is far from equilibrium, small islands of coherence in a sea of chaos have the capacity to elevate the entire system to a higher order. And in my mind, a lot of what we're working on is trying to create those small islands of coherence and then build bridges and ferries between them, to try to lay down the kind of foundational sense of community and collective action, so that we actually can move quickly and more fearlessly, and to where the resources need to go together in a way that none of us can do by ourselves. And I'll stop there and pass the mic.
Hey everyone, Matthew Monahan, and yeah, thank you, Lynn, and everyone for hosting and convening us. I still feel a bit strange, even context switching, because I know many of us are watching the news as we're recording this. And yeah, just prayers to everyone in the Middle East. Um, I my background, I started as kind of a cliche Silicon Valley entrepreneur um, in my early 20s and dropped out of school and started a business with my brother. And we sold that early on, around 15 years ago. And so my brother says we were a dog chasing its tail, and then we caught it one day. And so we were kind of stewarding capital early in our journey. And that's led me to this work around philanthropy. And I grew up in a household of avid environmentalists and found that the work around nature and regeneration was always what drew us in. And so for the better part of the last 15 years, I've been in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and we've been stewarding a land project called Mangaroa Farms, which is kind of a 1,200 hectare local food hub education center, deep in the practice around regenerative agriculture, reforestation, watershed management, ecological education, and similar themes. And then I wear the hat of a co-steward at Biome Trust. And so we do grant making and investments in this space. Um, Predominantly grant making, we identify as kind of a spend down foundation looking to put the money to work. And what speaks to us predominantly are kind of grassroots community projects, nature-based projects. Um, in total, over that period of time, we've allocated roughly 25 million to give you a sense of scope and size. And I currently, through that work, just continue to be confronted with so many amazing people doing the work on the ground, but having the barrier of capital and fundraising. And so I've returned back to my software roots, and alongside a team of about a dozen of us, we've been building a platform called Ma Earth, MA Earth, and we're building a community crowdfunding, philanthropic matching funding platform to try to help bring more resources and reduce these barriers that we're going to talk about on this call to grassroots nature projects around the world. And so those are the themes of my work. And yeah, just a privilege to be here amongst so many folks who I consider mentors and inspirations on the journey, and excited to connect.
Hi, everyone. Jennifer Estoni, really grateful to be on this call with you all today. Yes, there are so many inspiring leaders and co-collaborators and instigators. My journey has been about 15 years in this space of integrated capital between philanthropy and investing, and it was really sparked. I come from an anthropology background, so a very holistic perspective, and worked in grassroots response-based philanthropy for many, many years on the continent of Africa and globally, looking at women's human rights, HIV and AIDS, et cetera. And my inspiring moment came with Next Gen on a family foundation board who said, why are our investments not in alignment with our mission, which was focused on Indigenous people, agroecology, and biodiversity. And so I went on the journey with them. They said, Jen, we want you in on it. So we worked with a family office and a consultant and ended up selling the entire $60 million endowment and decided to put $10 million of it in an impact first capital preservation portfolio. And I went on that journey with them for a 5-year period, and we invested 28 investments of $8.7 million in a 5-year period. Since then, when I left Swift in 2019, I started working with other high net worth individuals and foundations to educate them on this journey. I didn't want to become a registered investment advisor. I believe that you don't need to be an expert to be able to manage and marshal your resources in this direction. And at Integrated Capital Investing, I realized that the clients that I had said, Jen, you know, these funds that I keep finding, it's greenwashing, it's impact washing. I'm like, no, there's really good product out there. You just can't find it. You can't see it. And from that pain point, I launched the Transformative 25, which is a list of 25 funds that comes out annually that are focused on people and planet and have a very different criteria for inclusion. And I'll talk more about that list. But to date, we've highlighted 109 funds that have raised over 1.5 billion in grant and investment capital that are focused on people and planet. And they've raised that from over 9,000 investors. So quite a few of the funds are crowdfunding based funds, which are really amazing. I think the one other thing I really want to say is I've been working alongside Collective Action for Just Finance and the T25 with the Agroecology Fund for the past 6 years. And it's really, I've worked in agroecology now for probably more than 20 years. And the beauty of where agroecology has come is we have these 13 holistic principles that bridge the environment and social justice and co-creation and participation, which is a very critical component of what many of the regenerative ag folks are missing, is how to human center it and also biodiversity center the work. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. But the Agroecology Fund is really trying to build the infrastructure through an agroecology fund of funds, which is a very exciting idea. And so I'm very interested in challenging myself and others to go on this journey through creating new infrastructure, just as Matthew was talking about. So ultimately, I call myself a financial activist now, and I am very delighted to be here today. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for the invite. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm Renata Minervo. I'm from Beat the Earth Foundation. I'm a co-founder, trustee, and head of philanthropy. And my background is actually as a social entrepreneur in Brazil back in the day. Started in 2009, so 17 years ago, working with participatory process and community engagement, very grassroots from the bottom up. And then I married into wealth and was gifted this opportunity of starting a family foundation with my partner, where we, from the beginning, integrated investment and philanthropy under the same vision. And it's been 6 years now. So we founded in 2020, and it's a kind of a endless journey towards coherence. And I think I don't have any financial background, but I have the experience of having been on the ground a lot and having navigated different sectors and stakeholders of the sector. And I think I brought this kind of participatory, decentralized questioning why scale everything, what success means, and how can we bring more of the people that we're trying to support in some ways, and also investigating what are the roots, because food system is a big topic for us at Beat the Earth, even though we don't frame ourselves as a theme-based organization. We're much more about the how. So we're like, how do we transition ourselves from an egocentric economy to an ecocentric where all life can thrive? And in that process is how can we also let go of the monocrop that we are kind of addicted to in terms of financial models and bring this diversity and this integration to find different paths that serve different purposes. So it's definitely not a one size fit all. And I probably have more questions than answers, but I'm happy to share them with you and a little bit of our experience on the journey. Thank you.
Thank you, Renata. Yeah, maybe just for all of us together with what we all know is moving in the world right now with this incredible group of panelists and just the wealth of experience and the commitment that we heard just in the introductions. Just want to invite us all to just take a moment to breathe together, to ground in. To recognize the privilege of what it is to be here together, internet's functioning, Zoom call, togetherness, to have this tremendous time together to listen. And maybe for each of us, before we receive more information, to listen to what do we feel like is the big paradox or the big contradiction, and really moving investment, philanthropy, monies, action, all that we do towards real systemic change to be in service of life. And we'll go through a series of questions and really listen to one another. And then at the end, we'll have some time for questions from those of you who are listening, and then see how we find our way to a pause for now and carry on. The questions will be gathered from the chat. And I also know that the wonderful folks of Regenerosity will be sharing resources with you all as well. So if it's hard for you to listen and pay attention to the chat, all is well. Everything will be shared and you can receive what serves today. With that, I felt to first start with Tim, who's been working on this one in a very long, like many different forms and many different ways, and is really one of the OGs or the vanguards in this field of moving investment into more aligned ways. To start with saying more about what is the big paradox that we've been navigating for a long time, and then offer what you see as that move towards coherence. You mentioned the islands of coherence, but what do you see possible in this moment that perhaps wasn't possible a decade or 20 years ago? And where's this paradox moving towards coherence? Just start with the big thing, Tim.
Yeah,
and,
right. I'm like, okay. There's all of these seedlings that have been growing all over the place for, decades and decades and decades. And so a lot of it is sort of pattern recognition and this hunger that we're seeing in terms of system. I mean, it's sort of the intersection of system elevation and awareness, and collectivization of wanting to pursue justice, and the realization that there's that full spectrum of assets, financial and non-financial, all interconnected. There's all these practices that have been sort of fomenting in I guess you could call it the sector. It's not really a sector. It's everybody doing everything all the time, everywhere. If that's a sector, then sign me up, I guess. But the what I see from our vantage point now is Catherine Fulton from Monitor Institute way back when said, I remember her at SOCAP, which we started back in 2008 in San Francisco, it's conference, getting up on stage and saying, like, there is this moral hunger that, and then I actually wasn't really sure that it was quite formed, though I loved the ring of it, as I was standing there next to her. But I do feel that there's this intersection of a number of things that have come to be, at this time, these seedlings that have sprouted up, these practices, this understanding of that full spectrum of resources and capital, system thinking, collective action, and a topical malaise or impatience or fear, that all kind of are coinciding in a place where I believe people are ready to actually move together in a way that maybe they weren't ready before the pandemic, or maybe they weren't ready in 2008. But I do feel, I mean, we're seeing that in the donor advised fund world as collaboratives come together. We're hosting 25. I was just doing a review the other day internally of 25 different collectives that are all doing everything from sustainable ocean to justice meets climate action in communities to shared ownership to, on and on and on and on, where people are able to move when the friction is removed and when people are in community, um, people are willing to go, first, fast, and fearless is kind of my alliteration there, um, in a in ways that I think we hadn't quite figured out maybe a decade ago or 20 years ago, but are starting to be um, experiences that common experiences that we're able to kind of lift up. So that, I mean, that's part of, I guess the answer is to me is actually pattern recognizing what's actually already going on and lifting it up as practice and really borrowing the design principles that are working in some and bringing them over to others, borrowing the asset allocators of some and porting them over to others. I've been really amazed at how people are willing to jump from one thesis or set of concerns in a portfolio of collective action to another that they maybe didn't even know they were that concerned with before. I was doing a panel with one of the leaders of one of these, a climate justice um, collective, the other day or two, a couple days ago, a couple weeks ago, and she was saying to everybody, half the people in the collective actually, I mean, of course they care about climate justice. It's not who couldn't care about climate justice, right? Like it's an important intersectionality. But they were there because they were moving in collective action with people that they knew and trust in a way that reduced all of the fear and that imposter syndrome or that feeling of not being enough. And Renata and I were both evoked the enough idea too. I think that a lot of it is, we're sort of caught in not feeling like we know enough, that we have enough, that we are enough in terms of these actions and showing up for what needs to get done. And I think that one of the fundamental to-dos for me, in my work and even just personally with our limited assets as a family is to answer that question in a really resounding way so that we can then proceed apace in a collective action with people that we know and love and trust about stuff that we care about. So that's an ethereal answer to your big question.
The big question. We'll keep tuning into this and but just to weave that, what I heard in that was there's been all these seedlings that now there's almost a ripening of an ecology that allows for more of this collective action. It's coming more from almost from the etheric into form and pathways for people to see possible. And with that, I want to turn to Renata, who has taken this in the embodiment of a foundation and ask you how you grapple with and or answer the question, what does full alignment look like? Through examples that you see, through how you've been working with it within the investments and philanthropy to really bring together the whole institution, or I might say, if I'm being more animist, the entity into a coherent purpose and vision.
Look, I think full alignment can mean so many different things depending on one's vision and values of the world. So I think I want everyone to take into account that it's like our fragment of our own vision of how we see the world can be better and thrive. And that starts in terms of the financial side of things. This operation of the whole portfolio under the same vision, and ideally under the same value and governance and all of that. Because currently, as probably all of you here in this webinar know, philanthropy is a teeny tiny bit of the resources of a family office or corporation or whatever, trying to fix all the problems that the investments are often feeding and nurturing, even though it's not nurturing to all life. So I think this kind of shift of these are completely separate things as they are different sectors. Tim asked, like, is this even a sector? I think if we're talking about deployment of capital, all of this, like investment, philanthropy, or other financial models, are different vehicles, but it's all how do we choose what money will feed and support, right? So I think in order to get to this alignment, we need to give up stuff. And especially people in a place of privilege, like me, for example. So we need to give up some decision making. So, for example, at Be the Earth, the way we do that is that 50% of our budget is not decided by us. We have different tools on how to do that, and I'm happy to share that further later on. But that's one thing. We need to give up profit maximizing. So how much is enough in terms of also return and all of that. We need to give up all the tax benefits and all the cracks into between the laws that we're very wisely taught how to do so, because it's basically, wanting to benefit those who created the laws in the first place. And we need to be able to find what are the roots. And as people here, we barely started this conversation and we already heard so many funds and initiatives and things that are already doing this. So I think there's a big thing about questioning the current narrative of money and what is the role of money, because I think we got to a point where we are serving it instead of it serving us. So I think I'll stop here for now, but it's a interesting thread to keep going on and on.
I really appreciate what you shared there with as you move towards what alignment looks like, that you started with all that you have to actually give up to work towards that alignment and or working towards coherence. So we have on the one side, like what's grown in the ecology, and the other, actually what has to be let go of. I remember that when Alnor and I were doing the research behind the book for Post-Capitalist Philanthropy, we often saw that a lot of the financial advisors and or the lawyers were kind of the gatekeepers. And we kept sitting with what would be that move to move the gatekeepers into the door openers. And so with that, I wanted to open it up to Jen and to Matthew to say, what have you seen? What are other kind of movements that lead towards greater coherence, or how this relates to the audaciousness in our title of systems change as we give up, as we work towards coherence? How are we inching ourselves towards systems that don't extract life, but honor life? So any comments from our other panelists here?
I'll jump in. So one of the things that I would say has been a theme in finance for a long time is inclusivity. But we're in a new phase where movements have organized, indigenous movements, native-led movements, people of color-led movements, women-led movements that are actually inviting us into a different dialogue. And one of the things that I hear again and again from these leaders is that relationship is centered over transaction. And that is a fundamental shift in finance because most finance is based on a lot of transactions, so you can extract the most out of it. And the funds on the T25 list have, 50, 25, 100 transactions. Some of them have more than that. But each of those investments is not a transaction, it's a relationship. And it's because those folks that they're lending to, or those communities or cooperatives, have been unbanked and underbanked. They're outside of the system. And so we really need to rethink how that capital flows. And that's why people are inventing new ways of flowing grant, investment, recoverable grants, loan loss guarantees, all this layered capital. So I would say, this relationship over transaction. And so one of the leaders that I follow is Amaka Agbo around restorative economics, who really regrounds us in history and context and fundamentally sort of a place-based approach. The other thing that I would say is that folks are really thinking holistically. And so they're place-based, community-informed, participatory approaches. And this is exciting. And it's mind-blowing for most people in finance who just look at numbers to include other things like community well-being, like, is the forest happy? Is the river intact? These questions that are fundamentally maybe philosophical or spiritual are being asked now. And that is a huge invitation, I think, for coherence. And it makes people sing not just around their values, but around something that's more deeply meaningful to who we are as human beings.
Yeah, I really love those comments, Jen. We used to joke that the only theory of change we understood was relationship, because we don't have some master theory of how to change the world, but it's going to start in relationship, certainly. Um, yeah, and I one of my mentors in this work, he likes to say that if you've met one philanthropist, you've met one philanthropist. Like they're all their own unique animal, and every family foundation and large office and donor like has unique characteristics that they bring to this work and points of view, and so I think like this question of coherence and alignment, it's really important that we recognize these silos that so much of this quote unquote sector not sector is really operating in. Um, when I was in kind of more of an entrepreneurial stance and raising money from investors, it felt much more coherent the way that the venture capital ecosystem operated. There was a lot more joint funding. There was a lot more, predictability. Here are the stages of investment, and here's what you have to do, and here's how the spreadsheets work. And like, as someone who had zero background in finance, trying to raise money in that environment in California felt more coherent 20 years ago than what I feel when I see the philanthropists working together nowadays. And so I think we have a lot of work to do to kind of align in the funding community. What are our norms and how are we going about these practices? And it's not to say it's not happening, it's just to say it's still really small. And I think my other thought, back to what you had started with, Ruth, like full coherence and alignment, we really have to keep our eye on the prize. It's where this whole identification of philanthropy wouldn't even necessarily exist. Like if we're talking about unlocking $1 trillion of assets, but that's less than 1% of the global economy, we're still talking about kind of a very small part of the problem. So yeah, those are some of my thoughts from what's been shared.
Thank you for that. Just bringing us into what actually is this paradox. And I think Matthew alluded back to that at the beginning. And many of us know this whole, the endowments on the one side or the investments on the one side are using the same metrics or the same logic, that's actually undoing often the work of the grant making. And what we heard in this first piece was tending to the relationality, tending to other ways of knowing, what some of us talk about with ontology. It's not to be esoteric philosophers. It's to recognize that there's many ways of knowing that are rooted in place, that are rooted in lineage, that understand what coherence and alignment is, and actually embrace this paradox. We'll come back to this, but we want to move into a lot of where these seedlings have been. And our panelists here are actually really working on various tools and infrastructure and vehicles to really move towards greater alignment and coherence. So let's come back and start with you, Matthew, with the project of what you're doing both with Ma Earth on alternative financial infrastructure and what's really required to get us towards regenerative investment and the pathways that can open when we start to build alternative financial infrastructure. You can speak about that, and then we'll turn to Tim to talk about other tools and vehicles that exist right now.
Yeah, I guess I would presence drafting off of also what was shared earlier, this bringing visibility to the amazing work that's happening. I think that when I put on my grant maker hat and I think about, okay, we have capital in this bank account, what is the barriers to moving that capital faster or in higher amounts to the projects that we're supporting? And for us, I think the answer is often around the conviction and the feedback loops that we're getting to have confidence that that's the best place for where that capital can be stewarded and deployed. And so, we at Ma Earth are thinking about how do we increase the trust and improve the visibility and amplify the projects that are happening on the ground. But of course, from a grant seeking perspective, like we all know this horrible, my colleague Sophia, who I see on the call, she calls it bureaucratic violence that we put grantees through to file all of these applications and do all of these impact reporting and to go through all these siloed, if every philanthropist is unique or every grant, resource is unique, then just think about the experience on the other side of that. So, yeah, like what are the interoperable systems and financial tools? And so we have a particular angle that we're pursuing to approach this more from a software lens, which we don't see happening in very many spaces, and from a shared interop and data interop lens, which I can geek out on if it's relevant at any point. The other thing I would presence that I see as a major barrier, and it speaks to Tim's work, and we're a client of Impact Assets, a very satisfied client, and there is a challenge around liquidity. So that's the other thing as a foundation that we have to often grapple with is we want to put our money into a fund that is more impact aligned, but it involves locking capital up for 5 to 10 years. And so we can stomach the lack of return profile, but often we can't necessarily stomach the lack of liquidity because we're concerned with how to ensure that we have enough capital to do the grant making, which is our priority. So that's one of the, I think, key barriers as well to presence.
I could jump in on that. I think you
Yeah,
were
please.
trying to line me up. Well, because that was actually one of the examples I wanted to give. So we have, $5 billion of money sloshing around, waiting to be deployed into coherent strategies or more or less coherent strategies, either alone or together in community. One of the things we did, what I thought really stood the test of time and was kind of a fundamental goodness at Impact Assets was we actually took all of the liquidity, which is this point is like $750 million, $750 million that most people have sitting in, whatever, and constructed our own internal liquidity pools around deep impact. And that's microfinance, that's affordable housing, that's project finance for community solar. It's all of those things and a lot more that allow the liquidity to be settling into a much deeper right relationship with communities and the planet, while people are figuring out those incisive long-term strategies. And and making that very I don't know about coherent. That's probably too much of a stretch, but although it's part of our coherent story, but making it easy to do that in collective scale in a super professional way, but where nobody has to be like juggling all of these different pieces. I thought that that was a really good design element, and we even got creative and started putting equity-like little slivers in there. Like we put $15 million of capital that went to the Community Development Financial Institution intermediary Calvert Impact Capital to allow them to leverage it to 100 million to put money out to communities across the United States and actually around the world. And embedding a very complicated technical piece of a sliver in $750 million. I'm not saying it was hidden. It's not. It's fully disclosed in the small print, but nobody needed to shoulder the complexity or even the exact profile of that because it's a tiny percentage of $750 million. Don't hold me to any of those numbers exactly, but that's directionally very accurate. So, I think doing designs like that can really hack the system of conventional wisdom around things like liquidity, and democratize participation in them. At the other end of the scale, another example of something, Builders Initiative, which is Lucas Walton's family office, they're publicly talking about this. So I don't feel like I'm, lifting up any veils or anything. They care deeply about sustainable ocean and have the largest portfolio of private investing in the world around sustainable ocean as a family office, as a multi-billion-dollar family office. They have invested in designing system boundaries and analysis with intention and leverage points and architecture and putting their own money first up into it, and are now sort of publishing and inviting in a wide range of other foundations and family offices into a system strategy around sustainable ocean. And so it's that kind of, and again, this sort of like coherent system design that I think we're at we just need to see a lot more of it. Another one that I just ran across is Co-Capital in the Gulf of California. And Co-Capital is doing amazing stuff bioregionally with a system point of view, poly capital for poly crisis, like really, really putting a ton of effort into articulating something. And the last thing I'll say, which is, more, I don't know, design wise, is just like investing in the narrative of the coherence is something I think we sometimes forget to do enough of. The narrative of coherence, the narrative of belonging, of collective action. What is the story we're writing ourselves onto? People respond to stories, and it's like we cut right down to the technicals, right? Like how much money are we moving, what ways? And I think the more that we can invest in creating those big inclusive narratives that are thoughtful and articulate, the better off we're going to be.
Wow, thank you for that. I was reflecting on, we often see a lot of the work on the narratives and the memetics and the activists, but we kind of have blunt instruments, almost like epistemological hegemony, if you will, when it comes to how we think about instruments and capital flows, rather than getting into the richness of the ecosystems of what you're speaking to. And I was reflecting on with what it means for us to be relational, to move the capitals as well. So when one family office creates a pathway, how do others have that trust and relationality to come in? And so I want to turn it over to Jen and Renata to chime in here to see what you would offer in terms of what tools and vehicles exist, or what you see in terms of building the alternative financial pathways and infrastructure needed for regeneration. And if I might just layer a couple things in there as well, what do you see that's in the way? Like what actually needs to shift for bigger, bolder, swifter action to be taken? Jen or Renata, either one of you, jump into these like little simple questions issue.
Well, I have sort of two layers of comments. So I'm not sure if they're going to layer together, but maybe I'll just start with just on the narrative question. Beloved Economies and the Buen Vivir Capital Institute, I think, are really doing some great work on that, as well as the Runway Rooted Project, in terms of shifting narratives in pretty dramatic and fundamental ways. But I think we also find this in the broader UN system around the 13 Principles of Agroecology, which, if you really read them and think about them, I mean, it was many, many years of many, many scientists and many activists coming together in movements. I think it's a fundamentally very transformative framework. But let's get down to what are the big blockages. For me, it's this concept of market rate. It's a terrible scourge upon the thinking. Market rate and perpetuity sort of work in lockstep, and very much are at the heart of many of the conversations that we have with the T25 funds and with capital providers. So why is that? Well, there's this concept of market rate. I don't even know what it is. I've had many philosophical conversations about what it is, where it is, etc. I would say fundamentally that, the wealth system that we have drives perverse incentives for financial professionals. That's the way it's set up. And so we need to think and deconstruct that. So one of the things that we've done at the Transformative 25 is we evaluate funds on 5 criteria. And interestingly, financial return is not one of them. So we think a fund is investable in as long as it tells you the return of rate that it's going to provide you. And it may just be capital preservation. And if you go in as an investor and say, all I'm looking for is my capital to be returned, that's actually 100% better than if you make a grant. It's a totally different return profile, right? So we look at social, relational, and ecological returns, measuring that, participatory ownership and governance, integrated capital, or the use of multiple resources, because we know that's transformative of the financial system, creative finance that's focused on community needs, and diverse teams. So I would always come back to not just who is benefiting or who is the communities that are benefiting, but who's actually running the fund and making decisions about finance. And so there's like some really specific and great examples out there of specific funds like FINAPOP, which I'm sure Renata is very familiar with, which is the Landless Peasants Movement Fund. It's over $13 million now, that funds loans and working capital loans and infrastructure loans and small loans to cooperatives, family associations and family groups that are investing in agroecology in Brazil. Amazing. There's the Reciprocity Fund, which actually has a capital preservation or a negative 20% return, which is focused on, it has an indigenous-led credit community, and it's funding coffee cooperatives and other kinds of food production in Central and South America. There's the NATIA Fund and Accelerator, which is very small, but it's a blended capital incubator and investment vehicle, and that has agroecology fundamentally as part of it. So what is the blockage? The blockage is it's a lot of work for a foundation to do the due diligence and actually even send the money overseas to Uganda or Brazil or wherever it may be. And so that's why the Agroecology Fund is talking about a fund of funds. So actually, that's a big idea that's talked about a lot among the 109 Transformative 25 funds, is couldn't we have a fund of funds that would be supporting these smaller funds? Their average size is $5 million, but they're touching so many relationships and they're doing so much incredible work. Many of them are much larger, are 30, 40, 50, $100 million after like a 5 or 10-year track record. But some of them want to stay small. So do we have the knowledge and the capacity to create funds of funds? And that's the voyage that the Agroecology Fund is on right now, is doing this feasibility study around that and what would that look like. It's probably a capital preservation fund. So I would say one of the blockages is Renata's question, Tim's question of what is enough. What's the capital that's in a foundation or in a community trust or an evergreen fund that can recirculate? How can we get this concept of recirculation into our ideas instead of just making a grant or making a lot of money off something and getting all the money back? How do we get recirculation and mimicking nature science into that? Okay, I've talked for quite a bit of time. I would just say that fear is a huge barrier in all this work. And so personally, we have to overcome fear every day. Yeah, and there's, of course, a lot of things, systematic misvaluing of externalities, and this whole concept of maximization in ag is just a huge problem. Of course, it's mimicked in finance. I'll stop.
Thank you for all of that, Jen. Yeah, we've been observing this piece of the fear, and it can be fear of whatever it is, comfort, certainty. If we get into the what is the enough, we actually find that it's self-protection or institutional protection fear, where we got resonance somehow, where often like this protection where we start to see either scarcity or hoarding are actually of the same source. And it often comes into fear or the work, but of kind of going it or being out ahead and what gets lost in that. And so I want to again ask Renata, put her in the hot seat in the many different realms that she navigates simultaneously in this learning journey to offer what you see is needed for movement, for swifter action towards coherence. And you can speak about that, and or you can speak about what you see as the big stuck and what's in the way, whether it's structural, cultural, emotional, the regulatory frameworks, whatever it is that's keeping us back from actually what we're hearing is that there's a lot that could move, but we're kind of in this moment of in between.
Easy one.
Yeah.
I think I'm gonna start kind of bringing the reflection of, let's say, a zoom out and how the financial system is structured. So how, like let's say, the tools and the ways we have, and even if we're trying to find an ethical place to put money, it's actually really hard to find. And I think it's a combination of narrative and people willing to prioritize that to be able to become more visible, because I actually trust there's more than enough tools and routes possible out there. It's just hard to kind of access them in some ways. Another thing that we keep discussing at Beat the Earth is what is the definition of risk and success. So that's one thing that not having a financial background sometimes gets us to ask very kind of curious questions, because when you think about the logic and the investment side, for example, people are locking their money, hundreds of thousands of dollars, if not millions, in one investment for 10 years. And then if the deal is not doing well, then they go there and put more money because they already put some, and it's kind of trying to de-risk. And in my head, it doesn't make any sense. Whilst in the philanthropy side, you're like, okay, you're getting $5,000 and you need all the results in 1 year. And if you don't deliver one thing that you wrote on your deliverable, whatever your application, you were going to cut your funding forever, right? So I think the definition of what risk means and what success means, it's really messy because it's very linear, it's very quantitative, and we know that we can't reach the root of the challenges and problems we're trying to face through just a linear numerical way of measuring what success means. I think I would also add, we've been talking here about the enough, right? So there's this really cool project, if you don't know, it's called the Enough Project, that help people to think how much is enough. And even though it seems kind of ridiculous, we're just taught that we need to grow, scale, and run after more and more money because that's success, that's fulfillment, right? So it's actually giving a step back. And even if you want to dream about the, I don't know, most over the top lifestyle, some people will get to a number and will still see there's a huge surplus. and what do you do with it? And I think when you get at peace with that decision, it's easier to kind of play around, if that makes sense. But I think that the uncertainty of the world nowadays is really, let's say, an obstacle on the way of people making this statement or decision or choice, because you never know what's going to happen tomorrow. And I totally agree. It's based on fear and scarcity mindset that we're like, but what if this happens? So maybe I need more, right? So I think that also kind of gets on the way. I think there's also this kind of lack of inner work and self-awareness and getting to know yourself and know what is important to you. What are your personal values? What is your culture that you come from? And what did you inherit? What makes you happy? We always joke, we never heard of anyone on their deathbed saying, I wished I worked more hours, or I wish I bought another house. People are usually saying what? I wish I spent more time with my family, that I saw my kids grow up, that I enjoyed the money and the empire I built. And instead I was just being a slave to it and didn't kind of make any of it. So it's like, it's kind of trying to reconnect that the outer work and the inner work are interdependent and very intertwined, right? So I feel if we can access what's actually important to us as individuals, that will reflect on the values of an organization and leadership and decision making and all of that. And sorry, you told me to speak about the stuck, and then you also asked something else that I got so into my line of thought that I forgot.
That's totally fine. We're gonna get touched back on it again. I feel like we're speaking about what is in the way or what the barriers are, and we began with that there is a relational way that is moving. There is all these seedlings. There is a lot of different emerging tools, instruments, actual ways of moving the capital in coherence. And so what we wanted to move towards before we open it up for a few minutes for some questions from those who've been listening is what you're seeing could move us beyond the conversation, and what some steps could be that you might all offer towards cohering investments within philanthropy, capital holders. I think Ruth likes to ask the question, what are some low-hanging fruit? Because our beloved Ruth loves action now, and action now that ultimately is going to benefit life and those who aren't part of this conversation. So some final takeaways, some final thoughts that you have in terms of what are steps that actually can move us towards cohering the investments? What are some places beyond just the conversation? Where are some ways that people can start to put what we've been discussing into action? And if something needs to let go of for that action to come in, you can speak to that. And then I'll save the big whopping question towards the end.
Cool. So maybe I'll start more on the philanthropy side of the conversation, because I think there's quite a few things and much more knowledgeable than me on the investment side. But I think if people here are a little bit into the conversations going on in conferences and all of that, we keep hearing over and over the importance of trust-based relationship, which was already touched here. And I think it goes much beyond the philanthropy, but there's this concept of trust-based and participatory grant making. So I think that's a very low-hanging fruit. There are lots of kind of toolkits and websites that very freely share ways how to do it. I'm also super available to support people who want to experiment in that sense. Unrestricted grants, long-term grants, and decentralized decision making. So letting go of the power of thinking we have all the answers. And even if you are the most academic genius. It's very different being on the ground and having the lived experience. Paper can take all the words, right? It can say all the things and create all the theories, but then in practice, things are very different. And I think takes me back to what I shared in the beginning, is what am I willing to give up in order to move towards this coherence? I think there's also one thing that I kind of dream of, and I don't know how to make it real, is that I think people are so creative. There are already so many ideas and initiatives and projects and collectives and cooperatives and all of that that are, compared to the scale of the traditional, let's say, financial market, they're all tiny initiatives. And I wonder if it would be possible to kind of cluster some of these together so they could get stronger and reach wider and deeper. So I think kind of collaboration is a huge thing. I would also share about kind of governance and ownership models, because I feel the current hierarchical kind of traditional governance just replicates a lot of the systems we want to change. So there's from, I don't know, sociocracy, which is kind of our organizational side of the governance, but there's also kind of steward ownership or employee ownership. So lots of different models that are also bringing this shared power, voice of people, diverse kind of backgrounds that can add a lot when you're dealing with complexity and meta crisis. And I think, yeah, relationship, I know I'm kind of stealing, but not stealing, because I also made notes on that. That is like, I feel it's the main tool to build trust, to, to be back to being humans and remembering why we're doing this in the first place. And yeah, not so we don't act only from our heads, but from our hearts as well, from our whole being. Otherwise, how can we do anything differently?
Tim, Matthew, or Matthew's off mute. Matthew.
Yeah, I'd love to continue to pull on that theme of the trusted relationships, and also just to acknowledge or weave in a few of the comments in the chat. I saw one about kind of trying to raise investment for social enterprise, trying to raise capital for kind of the bioregional movement, and some shifts in the funding landscape there, as well as kind of like the early stage and how to move beyond just financial returns, and thinking about all the different forms of capital and convincing funders. And so I guess, my general feeling in response to those threads is very resonant with Renata in terms of starting with relationship. And I guess, just to offer one perspective of how to make that more tangible. I think, to me, the the landscape as a funder, I would say, um, what works best is when people approach from that true intent to get to know and understand us, what we're doing, who we are as people, rather than only starting with, hey, can I get $50,000 for this project? Because that's like the relationship starts with relationship, right? So that would be one way to think about it, is just like, how would you approach someone on the street that you just met? Um, and, I think where we end up finding resonance with whatever we want to say, grantee partners, um, it's usually being in the room where people are focused on a particular mission or challenge or piece of work. So it's not going to a philanthropy conference and then meeting someone that we want to give money to. It's more like showing up in a community food gathering, talking about regenerative agriculture, and then finding. So, that's really good news, because it's like you go where the work is, and you'll naturally then bump into, maybe not so often, but you'll naturally bump into people with surplus resources or people who want to give. And a lot of givers and donors out there aren't putting flashy brochure websites up and telling the world, hey, we're giving out funds. And part of that's also a trained behavior because once you do that, you're just kind of inundated with requests and asks, right? So operating with the understanding that there is abundance all around us, and there are people who care, and there are people with capital, and they care deeply about the work, and you may just not know at any given point in time that that's available. And so I think the only logical response is to just be in authentic human relationship. A lot of the grants that we've given out, and we have kind of looked at our historical data and so forth, like it often starts with relationships that were built over years before there was a grant, right? Now, that's a lot to ask, of course, but again, it's really just being on the journey together around the work. And then a final, I guess, note would be really what I see often or what I feel often is that projects ask for a lot up front, and the impulse I would have is to start a bit smaller and more attend to the knitting in one particular activity, one particular quarter, year, season, one particular initiative. Often will get pitched with kind of very grandiose, lofty ambitions, which sound fantastic, but it's like it's just too big of an ask for us to grapple with. And so, I would say like think about the journey with the funder as being a series of many steps. And so maybe that first grant is smaller, and you're building trust, you're building rapport, you're building relationship, rather than just kind of going for the big one lump sum up front. Those would be just some, I guess, yeah, comments from my side.
I can just pitch in a few thoughts. So I believe in challenging yourself and getting uncomfortable. So if you're not currently in this work, you're not going to be moving towards something that's truly transformational unless you're a little uncomfortable. You're on your learning edge. And in this field, actually, I mean, if you look at the Transformers 25 and a lot of impact assets and Be the Earth's work, a lot of these organizations need grant capital alongside the investment capital for loan loss reserves, for operating. A lot of CDFIs that are working with indigenous communities, they rely on grant capital to provide that extra mile training to help their communities actually access their capital in their native
Mhm.
CDFIs or wherever they may be. So there's a lot of opportunity to even just start with a grant and then come in with investment capital. But I would say at Swift, we jumped in. We made 4 to 6 investments a year, anywhere between 50,000 and 500,000. We made commitments of, a year to 7 years. We invested in some funds. We were first investors into some funds. And that's what I tell people who have high risk capital, be a first investor. If you think the team really is going to go someplace. So we invested Nest, which some of you may know, has the Lirio fund now. We invested in their first fund. Swift made I think a $250,000 5-year investment, or maybe a 6-year investment at 3 or 4%. And they actually paid off last year. That was 6 or 7 years later. And Swift is now a spend down. And so they no longer have an investment in there. But that was every fund needs a first investor in the door. So, don't be afraid to be the first one. All you're going to, it could just turn into a grant, and that's fine on your books. And then I'm just really big believer in practice and then learning from your practice. I think, what Tim and Matthew and Renata have been saying, it's an iterative process. You get better, you get stronger. And, my focus in agroecology has gone from how do we improve the export markets and help folks get better prices for their coffee and their cacao and their sesame and the cashew, to now like, well, why aren't we investing in sweet potatoes and millets and greens for local resilient economies. Like, why aren't we investing money in that? And how do we get money into that? And frankly, the return profile on that is like way low. Like, you think it's low for coffee and it's variable in coffee and cocoa. Let's start talking about feeding local markets with local foods, locally relevant foods. That's even a much harder lift. And so now I know that I'm into the really interesting questions. So there's a huge movement of folks working on this, and they're unsung heroes, and they don't make a lot of noise. So I agree with Matthew. You got to go to them, find them, but they're out there. Tim knows a lot of them. Matthew knows a lot about. Renata knows a lot of them, and I know Lynn knows a lot of them. So we're all resources, and I know everybody's totally willing to follow up with somebody if you have a specific geographic or other interest. And if I don't know, I'll forward you on to somebody, because I know I don't know very much, frankly. I'm just trying to connect people up.
Tim, do you want to bring us home?
I was like, what could I add to all of that? In the interest of being additive and not redundant, I would just say I loved that uncomfortable comment that was made. I'd add to that uncertainty, like being comfortable with holding uncertainty, which is quite uncomfortable during the design process. So it's like collectivizing and creating a space for system design so that you can actually deal with polycapital sort of coherence in your design, but then creating enough of a prolonged state of uncertainty where you're not driving to these answers as funders or even as social entrepreneurs, but really opening up for a proximate leader input sort of design process around what the elements are of capital needs and terms and structures and how much is enough and how does policy fit in and philanthropy fit in and market rate and not market, all of that. Once you start like locking it down, you start excluding people writing themselves onto the collective story. And that can be a galvanizing, when you do that, it will move whoever you've let into action. But if you do it too soon, you're excluding a lot of richness in terms of the stakeholder representation in the design process that I think that was the one thing I wanted to add to that part of the conversation, and I'll leave it at that.
Just want to say deepest gratitude to each of our panelists for offering so generously. And I have the uncomfortable task of finding how we move from here with the chronos and the kairos of time at the moment. And I have some of the questions that have been offered from those of you who are listening. And as I was looking at them, they were essentially questions about how at this particular moment where we're in with the poly crisis and the meta crisis, how do we think about where we intervene with our time, with our energy, with who we're collaborating with, whether that be government, other foundations, and others asking a question of like, just how do you deal with some of the family office dynamics itself? So what I want to offer for some of those questions is this is why this is a first part of a 4-part webinar series. And we really do want to dig deeper into kind of different approaches of blended capital. There's been a host of different funds and offerings spoken to on this. So we can go back and try to listen and do some carrying forward from this into the next webinar as well. And so with your forgiveness and permission, I'm going to leave the questions there for now and endeavor to just make a couple closing comments and then turn it back to Faith and Ruth. Sorry, they're very related beings. As I was really listening, I was really struck by both the sets of design principles that emerged in this of how do you think about aligning for coherence. I was listening to the the nascent ecology that is ripe and ready to receive capital, whether it be the fund of funds, the little funds. There was a whole lot of, this is the family office question, of honest inner work that is needed to be honest about what you're willing to let go of, who you're willing to be in collaboration with, and what you're defining as return. You know, perhaps, if I may, we're in a moment where we're looking not just at returns for investments or high end, but return for life. What are some of the returns for resiliency and regeneration and recirculation really rooted in place, and what that requires of us to walk in relationship, to not wait until trust is built, but to walk in and trust that it's enough, that we can foreground the relationship, we can foreground the journey rather than the destination, recognizing that this is this pivotal moment that we're in. We don't know, we're moving into, as many of us know, cascading uncertainties. So how do we really not avoid that with further protection, but recognize that we're offering up some of our uncertainties, but that doesn't preclude action anyway? I was hearing some work about finding better work with narratives, and perhaps looking to what Wayne Vivir and others have been doing to really be at the vanguards of narratives, to listening to those working in the global majority and our Indigenous elders who have a sense of what wealth really is and what returns on life are, and how we walk in right relationship with them. And as I said in the beginning, perhaps we're moving from the paradox to coherence, or embracing the contradiction. And ultimately, what is it to compost the very extractive dominant structures that we have upheld for far so long, that have been giving returns to the owner, to the private, rather than to the collective and to life? We'll get into deeper, what is change, what is transformation, what are the many ways of being and knowing, as we really listen and walk together for how money can continue to walk in service of life. And I think we'll tackle notions of ownership and entitlement towards ones that are the commons and stewardship. We won't resolve any of these, but we will not shy away from wrestling with them. And as Jen said, we're here if we can be of service in some way. And with that, I'm going to say thank you once more. And whatever way you can, just silently or with some sort of reaction, just send your gratitude to the generosity of experience, and really grappling with us, our wonderful panelists here today. So Faith.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Just trying to pull some people out. I would love for you all to be up here. I just want to say thank you deeply to Lynn for moderating such an incredible discussion, such a needed discussion for so many of us. And thank you to Matthew and Jen and Tim and Renata. Deep thank you to Renata for working with us for the past 5 years and being able to hold these types of discussions. We're so grateful to have the work that you're all doing in the world, and the people that are also on have joined this webinar. We know many of you are also practitioners and some foundation leaders, and yeah, we're just such a deep bow of gratitude to you all for the work that you're doing. This is one part of a series of 4 webinars, as Lynn said, so please continue to stay in the loop, sign up for our newsletter. If you love this webinar, we are an intermediary, a very small intermediary. Think about donating. And then, yeah, just stay in the loop. I'd love for everybody to come off mute and give a voice of gratitude to the speakers today.
Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you
very much.
Thank you all. Wonderful. Thank you. Great job.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Fantastic. I'll be back. Thank you all. Deep gratitude.
Do widzenia.
I'm a joy.
Dankjewel. All right. Thank you all.
Thank you.
We'll
Thank
see
you.
you soon on the next webinar. Thank you again, Lynn.